What if the greatest betrayal of the 20th century was not fought with bullets or bombs, but sealed with kisses and wedding vows? What if, while millions of young men died believing in the image of the faithful woman waiting at home, a hidden migration of women was rewriting the genetic future of entire nations? This is not a conspiracy theory. This is the unspoken secret of the war bride phenomenon, when tens of thousands of women in the ashes of World War II abandoned the old order of loyalty and continuity to follow foreign soldiers into a new life. And the truth behind it is as shocking as it is undeniable. It was female hypergamy unleashed at a scale history had never seen before. Imagine the landscape of 1944 Europe. Cities reduced to rubble, fathers and brothers buried in unmarked graves, and the thin veil of civilization stretched to breaking point. In that chaos emerged a new kind of opportunity, invisible to those still clinging to ideals of fidelity. Hypergamy, the evolutionary impulse driving women to seek the highest status made available, was suddenly operating in an open field. The local men were dead, wounded, or imprisoned. The surviving few were broken, poor, and stripped of the very status that once made them attractive. In their place appeared a new figure, the foreign soldier. He arrived with clean uniforms, regular rations, cigarettes, chocolate, and an aura of victory. To the traumatized eyes of women who had lived through hunger and fear, these men were not merely allies. They were walking lifeboats, but the real shock lies in the scale. Historians estimate that by the end of the war, over 100,000 women from Britain, continental Europe, and Asia had married foreign soldiers and followed them across oceans. To the men who returned from the front, expecting devotion, this was an unthinkable betrayal. The sweetheart they had clung to in letters was gone, her affections transferred to a stranger whose only qualification was that he had arrived at the right moment in history. To the women themselves, it was not betrayal at all. It was survival, social advancement, and a once-in-a-lifetime chance to escape the ruins of a crumbling world. And this is where the romantic propaganda crumbles. The war bride was not simply the tale of love blossoming amidst destruction. It was a ruthless biological market operating beneath the polite veil of weddings and immigration papers. Each choice was a calculation. Who could provide safety? Who could open the door to a better life? Who stood above the crowd in a time when the crowd was starving? Female hypergamy, stripped of pretense, operated with surgical precision. The myth of unconditional female love was shattered, replaced by something colder but more honest. The instinct to secure the best possible future, no matter what story the culture wished to tell, the image of a war bride has been polished into romance for public memory. A shy woman boarding a ship, her hand in that of the soldier she married, tears in her eyes as she leaves behind the land of her birth. But the truth, stripped of Hollywood's varnish, is far less sentimental. What really happened was the creation of a marketplace unlike anything seen before, where status, security, and survival outweighed old loyalties and small-town promises. Picture the streets of London in 1944. Bombed-out blocks, ration lines, fathers and brothers gone, and then suddenly American GIs appear. Young, confident, well-fed, their uniforms crisp, their pockets full of things unimaginable in scarcity. Nylon stockings, chewing gum, canned meat. To a woman who had been scraping food from the bottom of a tin, who had slept in air raid shelters while her home burned above her, the GI wasn't just a man. He was an exit. He was proof that another world existed, one untouched by rubble and starvation. He represented mobility, literal ships and planes that could carry her across the ocean into a new life. And this wasn't limited to Britain. Across occupied Europe, in Italy, France, Belgium, even Germany itself, the presence of foreign troops created a sudden upheaval in the sexual and romantic economy. Men who had once been respectable, the shopkeeper, the factory worker, the farmer, were now powerless. Their authority had evaporated in the face of foreign uniforms and foreign paychecks. Women who had grown up expecting to marry within their village suddenly recalculated. Why anchor oneself to a sinking ship when lifeboats walked the streets in khaki and olive drab? This is where hypergamy revealed its brutal efficiency. For thousands of women, the decision was made with chilling clarity. Stay with the man whose prospects had been reduced to rubble, or attached to the man who had chocolate, cigarettes, and the promise of a ticket to America, Canada, or Australia. Love stories were written, but beneath them lay a Darwinian calculus. The war bride phenomenon was not about passion. It was about opportunity cost. Of course, this left men shattered. Soldiers returned home from the front lines expecting a warm embrace, and discovered instead that the woman they had imagined waiting faithfully had moved on. Some with neighbors, some with soldiers from other regiments, some with foreigners. Letters filled with devotion turned out to be placeholders, security measures, while the real choices were made face-to-face under blackout curtains or in barracks dances. The mythology of eternal loyalty crumbled when confronted with the fact that scarcity had tilted the balance of desire. And here is the secret no one admits. Governments knew. Military records and declassified files reveal not only the logistics of transporting war brides, but also the moral panic it caused. Officials worried about national reputations, about the appearance of their soldiers stealing the women of allies or enemies alike. Yet they also understood the inevitability. Once status disparities are laid bare, human instincts follow them with ruthless logic. No propaganda, no sermon, no plea for loyalty could outmuscle the primal drive to secure the best possible mate under the worst possible conditions. To grasp the full impact of the war bride phenomenon, you must imagine what it did to the minds of men. These were not just soldiers who risked their lives on foreign soil. They were men raised on the promise that honor, service, and sacrifice would guarantee them loyalty. They clung to the idea that love was a covenant that distance and danger could not break. But when the war ended, many discovered that the covenant had been rewritten without their consent. The photograph tucked into their breast pocket, the letters they carried through mud and blood, had become relics of a story that no longer existed. This was more than heartbreak. It was a cultural earthquake. Communities that had been tightly knit, where marriage within a town or parish was the unquestioned norm, suddenly witnessed women disappearing. Some left in ships bound for New York, Sydney, or Toronto. Others simply shifted allegiance locally, marrying men who had survived with higher rank, better pay, or foreign connections. To the men who returned, the message was devastatingly clear. Their sacrifice had not shielded them from disposability. Their blood had not guaranteed loyalty. The mythology of female devotion nurtured in propaganda posters and sentimental films was shattered by the cold arithmetic of hypergamy. And yet, from the women's perspective, this was not cruelty. It was adaptation. It was the refusal to sink with a sinking ship. Consider the psychology of a young woman in war-torn France. Her fiancé was drafted, vanished into the Eastern Front, and likely never returned. Meanwhile, Allied forces swept through her town, their soldiers fed, healthy, laughing, even in the midst of destruction. To bond with one of them was not merely attraction. It was anchoring her life to a future that still existed. Her instinct whispered that survival meant aligning with strength, resources, and power. The old loyalties dissolved under the weight of reality. This is the unspoken cruelty of hypergamy. It does not operate on sentiment, but on context. It does not ask whether a man is good or worthy. It measures almost unconsciously who has status, who has prospects, who offers the greater probability of survival for her and her children. In peacetime, this instinct may be moderated by norms, by culture, by the gradual pace of courtship. But in the furnace of war, with entire nations collapsing, hypergamy operated with raw, merciless clarity. The war bride was not a dreamer swept away by romance. She was a strategist in a ruined world. The shockwave of this reality extended across generations. For the men who were left behind, bitterness festered. For the women who departed, many struggled in foreign lands, sometimes welcomed, sometimes ostracized. And for the children born of these unions, their very existence became proof of how war had rewritten the rules of desire. The war bride secret was not just about who married whom. It was about how quickly the supposed foundations of love could be replaced by the imperatives of survival. When the war bride phenomenon exploded, governments faced an uncomfortable dilemma. They could not openly admit what was happening without undermining morale. Yet the scale of the migrations made it impossible to ignore. So they did what states have always done when biology collides with ideology. They reframed it, sanitized it, and turned it into propaganda. Instead of acknowledging hypergamy at work, officials wrapped the phenomenon in the language of love and sacrifice, painting it as a noble merging of nations through marriage. In reality, what they were managing was a crisis of perception. For example, Britain faced the uncomfortable reality of tens of thousands of its women leaving with American GIS. Some saw it as a national humiliation, proof that foreign men with rations and swagger could lure away their women while British men fought and died. In response, newspapers were carefully edited, official reports softened, and ceremonies staged to portray these unions as touching stories of devotion against all odds. The truth that many of these women were making calculated choices to secure a better life was never allowed to surface publicly. Meanwhile, in America, Canada, and Australia, governments worried about public backlash to the sudden influx of foreign brides. Military departments issued guides on how to integrate them, even as whispers circulated that many were opportunists, women who had traded loyalty for the allure of a ticket out of ruins. The fear was not unfounded. Records show that in some cases, war brides quickly divorced their soldier husbands after securing citizenship, moving on yet again in pursuit of stability and status. These instances, though not the majority, revealed the blunt logic of hypergamy operating in its rawest form. Even Hollywood played its part. Post-war films depicted romances between soldiers and European women as fairy tales born out of tragedy, carefully obscuring the social tension that simmered underneath. The cultural machine understood something critical. Men could not be told that their sacrifices had been repaid with abandonment. To maintain order, the narrative had to shift. War brides became symbols of unity, not opportunism. Love across borders was portrayed as destiny, not desperation. But beneath this cultural repainting, the scars remained. Entire communities whispered about women who had run off with soldiers. Men returned home to find themselves competed by strangers they'd never seen, stripped not only of their sweethearts, but also of their sense of masculine worth. Families fractured, friendships dissolved. The propaganda could not erase the lived reality that hypergamy had redrawn the map of intimacy under conditions too extreme for tradition to withstand. This is the true weight of the war bride secret. It was not just a collection of marriages, but the collapse of a cultural illusion. Governments tried to mask it, artists tried to romanticize it, but the men who lived through it could not unsee the truth. They had discovered, often too late, that loyalty is contingent, and that when the world is burning, female desire reorients itself toward whoever can offer the clearest escape from the fire. The war bride phenomenon was not just a footnote of history. It was a turning point in how men and women related to one another in the modern age. It tore a hole through the myth of unconditional female loyalty, exposing a truth that men rarely dared to articulate, but could never again fully ignore. When the dust settled after 1945, millions of men carried home not only physical scars, but also a new and unsettling suspicion. That love was not immune to circumstance. That devotion could be eclipsed by opportunity, and that hypergamy, long theorized, rarely acknowledged, was not a marginal tendency, but a force capable of rearranging entire societies. The long-term effects rippled through marriages, family structures, and even cultural attitudes toward romance. In the United States, Australia, and Canada, the sudden presence of war brides introduced both fascination and unease. Some marriages blossomed, proving that survival choices could become genuine love, but others collapsed under the weight of disillusionment. Divorce rates rising as the fairy tale veneer wore thin. Children of these unions grew up straddling two identities, living proof of the biological market that had played out on the ruins of Europe and Asia. In some towns, they were celebrated as symbols of new beginnings. In others, they were whispered about as reminders of betrayal and opportunism. For the men who lost their sweethearts to this hidden marketplace, the impact was profound. Their trust was not just broken, it was rewritten. Many returned from war believing that loyalty was fragile, that promises made in letters could evaporate when confronted with higher status alternatives. And in subtle ways, this suspicion began to shape how men thought about relationships in the decades that followed. You can trace a line from these wartime disillusionments to the growing cynicism of the post-war generation, a seed of doubt planted deep in the male psyche. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the war bride secret is what it revealed about the conditions under which hypergamy thrives. When scarcity and fear dominate, when men are removed en masse and status hierarchies are disrupted, female choice becomes brutally pragmatic. This was not a story about shallow desires for luxury. It was about survival, about attaching oneself to whoever could provide a lifeline out of chaos. And once women experienced this freedom, the ability to choose outside their village, their class, even their nation, something irreversible shifted. The war accelerated not just women's entry into the workforce, but also their awareness of their own leverage in the mating market. The men who fought believed they were fighting for nations, for families, for the girl back home. What many learned too late was that they were also fighting in a parallel battle they never understood. A biological contest where medals, loyalty, and sacrifice meant less than the cold arithmetic of security and status. The secret of the war bride is not only that women chose differently than expected, it is that the entire narrative of romantic loyalty was in that moment revealed to be conditional. And that revelation casts a long shadow even today, for once you see that love can be rewritten by circumstance, once you see that devotion can be redirected by survival instinct, you can never again pretend that loyalty is guaranteed. You realize painfully that beneath the stories we tell about romance lies a truth that is neither cruel nor kind, but simply human. Hypergamy is always waiting, silent until the world falls apart and then undeniable in its power. So what do we take from this hidden chapter of history? Not bitterness, not resignation, but clarity. The war bride phenomenon is not simply about women making choices in extraordinary times. It is about stripping away illusions that men still cling to. It tells us that loyalty, as beautiful as it sounds in poetry and as comforting as it appears in films, is never absolute. It is always bound to context, to resources, to survival. That is not cynicism. That is reality. A reality written in ships filled with brides, in letters never answered, in soldiers staring at empty doorsteps when they returned. For men today, the lesson is sobering but liberating. Stop believing in unconditional devotion. Stop thinking sacrifice alone guarantees loyalty. Women, like men, are wired to adapt, to seek the best future available. In peacetime, it may be disguised by rituals, ceremonies, and culture. In wartime, it is revealed in its naked truth, and if it was revealed once in the crucible of World War II, it can be revealed again in any crisis that strips away stability. But there is power in facing this because once a man accepts that loyalty is conditional, he stops wasting his life trying to purchase it with blind devotion. He stops imagining that suffering alone will earn him love. He begins to understand that relationships are built not on promises floating in the air, but on the concrete value he brings, his strength, his vision, his ability to lead a life worth following. The war bride secret is not a condemnation of women. It is a warning to men. Build yourself into the kind of man who does not beg for loyalty, but commands it through the life he creates. And that is why this truth matters. Not because it is comfortable, but because it frees you. It tears away the illusion of romantic guarantees and leaves you with something sharper, harder, but infinitely more useful. The knowledge that you must never surrender your life, waiting for devotion that may never come. You must forge your own status, your own path, your own power. Because when the world collapses, when scarcity returns, and when instincts resurface, only the man who stands strong will not be left behind. Like, share, subscribe.